Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin, and I'm with the Invasive Species Council of BC. We'll be starting the webinar in about 5 minutes. We're just waiting for a few more guests to join us. Welcome. My name is Caitlin Bassat, and I am the Kamloops Youth Facilitator with the Invasive Species Council of BC. Thanks to everyone for joining us today for this webinar entitled Engaging Key Audiences Around Invasive Species, Volunteers Taking Action. This webinar is being presented by Sue Staniforth, who is the Education and Outreach Manager with the ISCBC. As you know, invasive species are a serious issue worldwide, and it is vital to engage and support all British Columbians in taking action. Sue will explore recent research into engagement and review a variety of educational strategies and new resources that support audiences in tackling invasive species in their communities. I hope you all had a chance to sign in early and get any technical glitches worked out. If you are still experiencing any problems, write a note in the chat box and we'll see if we can assist you. Everyone has been muted, so you should only be able to hear myself and Sue. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the chat box in the right-hand column of your screen. Sue will be taking time at the end of the presentation to discuss questions if there's enough time to do so. If we run out of time to address all of the questions, we will send out the questions and answers by email. To begin, we'd like to find out who is here and where you all work, or what your areas of interest are. If you haven't already, can you all please type in your name and workplace or area of interest in the chat box, and we can review them while I'm introducing Sue. Thanks. At this point, I am pleased to give a warm welcome and introduction to Sue Staniforth, the Education and Outreach Manager with the ISCBC, joining us today from Courtenay, BC. Sue has over 30 years of experience as a biologist, educator, and curriculum developer, and holds a Bachelor of Science in Honors Biology and a Master's of Science in Environmental Education and Resource Management. Sue has broad experience working with a range of youth groups, volunteers, and communities, and has developed over a dozen learning resources in use both provincially and nationally. She is also the chair of a local stewardship group on Vancouver Island. In her presentation, Sue will speak to the importance of engaging and supporting all British Columbians in taking action on invasive species. Young people are a particularly important audience, as invasive species, unlike many large-scale environmental issues, are something that youth can actually do something about in a hands-on experiential way. Sue will explore recent research into public engagement and review a variety of educational strategies and new resources that support a range of audiences in tackling invasive species in their communities. At this point, I will pass the mic over to you, Sue, and I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I hope you can hear me okay. Thanks for so many people to join today on such a snowy and cold day. It's a snowy one on the island too, which is kind of a rarity here. Thanks, Caitlin, for the introduction. As you said, we're going to be talking about engaging audiences around invasive species and some of the challenges and opportunities that we've got to do that. I want to thank our sponsors. Our youth program is generously funded by the Government of Canada through their Canada Service Corps program, and that's been a great help to our youth volunteers and facilitators. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the current research on engagement, on public engagement in particular, and then some of the challenges. These challenges have been around for a long time, but this whole idea of disconnection from the environment, the duality that we feel with the environment, denial is a big one, and also powerlessness, feeling helpless around some of these issues. Of course, we have to look at some solutions, and I know that there's lots of people in the room today that have some great strategies and techniques that they can share as well. I hope to hear from you in the chat box, and then we'll talk about some resources and research done on volunteering. So, of course, engagement is a critical thing because all of us are involved with invasive species. We are the main vectors and pathways of spreading them around, so all audiences are pretty important to target. They're a serious issue worldwide, as you well know, and the IUCN calls them an issue second only to habitat loss in impacting biodiversity. So targeting specific audiences with information and resources that are relevant and applicable and user-friendly is a really key element of being successful with your engagement. And young people are particularly important audiences, as Caitlin alluded to. We can do something about invasive species, and we can do something in a hands-on way. So it really helps with the powerlessness aspect. Again, the golden rule is to target your audiences very specifically. Know who you're going to be dealing with, whether it's a volunteer group or an angler or a boater or young kids. So again, taking a look at the audiences and taking a look at some of the tools that we can use are both really important pieces. So again, I spoke briefly to these challenges, and they've been around for a long time as an environmental educator, and they're I'll go through them individually, but the big ones are disconnection, dualism, denial, and powerlessness. So let's take a look at those specifically. So the disconnection piece comes from many things. As you know, you probably know that most of us, it's kind of a shocking statistic, but most of us spend a lot of our times indoors, and a big population on the planet now lives in cities. So the issue around that is we are physically separated from the natural world, and it's just that much more challenging for some of us to actually get out and play in it, especially if we don't live close by to it. Technology. So these seductive tools that most of us have access to daily have also played a big, and some would say negative, role in disconnecting young people as well as adults from the natural world. As well as from other things like relationships, I think. And we've all heard the statistics. Kids today spend an average of 7 to 8 hours in front of screens. That's a shocking statistic. And of course, it's been linked to increased rates of obesity, ADHD, anxiety, even things like, believe it or not, spinal malformations. So it's exciting to me because a lot of public health officers and doctors have recognized this, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's a interesting and challenging tool that we have in our technologies. So let's talk about dualism a little bit. So dualism is, there's an assumed polarity or an assumed separation between humans and the environment. Environmental issues are often framed this way as well. We often talk about negative things that are happening to the environment as if we are somehow separate or independent from the environment. So it's easy to think that the environment is not inclusive of us as well, and the whole interdependence that we have, that we rely on, is something separate. So the third one is essentially, well, let's talk a little bit about the invasive species challenges. So denialism has their own, invasive species have their own challenges around denialism, but essentially it's the rejection of undisputed scientific facts. So this is different than scientific debate because it actually attempts to manufacture some uncertainty on specific topics. And, a big one, of course, these days is climate change. It's been used with tobacco smoking for many years, the whole business of denying the impacts of tobacco, evolution. There's lots of things, and invasive species are now included in this list. And I've given you a couple of references there to take a look at. There's some interesting studies that have been done on this specifically for invasives. And then the fourth one is this whole idea of powerlessness or helplessness. And this is it also applies to other large-scale issues with the environment and other things. And it was coined during the nuclear era, this whole idea of psychic numbing. Once you realize just how bad a situation is, for example, the thousands of nuclear warheads that exist that can destroy the planet, you don't want to hear any more about this situation, and you shut out any further information. And I think this has happened to a great extent around climate change too, the enormous impacts of climate change that are happening, around the planet, and just the helplessness and the depression or the despair that can really lead to an apathy. You sort of tune out. It's just too big of a problem or too big of a crisis, and you feel like you can't do anything about it. So this whole idea of being fueled by a lack of concrete actions to take is a big challenge that I think many of us are facing with these big issues. So as I said earlier, the issue of invasive species poses its own challenges as well. So in addition to the four we've mentioned, there's some distinct types of difficulties or challenges. And we'll take a look at those in separately as well. So it's an interesting one. Again, looking at some of the papers done by Courchamp and et al., they're taking a look at some of the issues around understanding the whole business of alerting or being aware of invasive species, people actively supporting invasive species, and then also the funding and implementing any kind of actions. So the whole business of understanding, this comes from a bunch of different places, I think. I think there's generally a poor understanding across much of the general public as to what invasive species are and why they can, be a serious issue. And the inconsistent and the confusing terminology that we use doesn't exactly help this, because people get confused by the terms that are thrown out there around what an invasive species is. And the research also tells us that there's not a strong basis in the general public for understanding ecological concepts, such as interdependence and such as systems theory. So this whole idea of impacts, can be somewhat foreign to folks. So the second idea of alerting, the main challenges there is measuring and demonstrating the impacts. So alerting is being aware of or alert of invasive species in our environment and noting their impacts. And time is a big factor here. Sometimes it takes a long time for impacts to show up in a big way. And then there's the whole challenge of burden of proof. Did purple loose strife destroy that marsh, or did burdock take over a field, or did something impact an ecosystem, or there's so many other competing and complex factors there that it's hard to say specifically, oh yes, that's that invasive species that degraded that habitat. So that's an interesting and big challenge too. And then there's the whole issue of supporting. So invasive species, there's nothing wrong with them in many ways. They're in our world, and there's this whole idea of sympathy capital. So there's some beautiful invasive species. I mean, knotweed, can be argued that it's a pretty beautiful plant with its heart-shaped leaves and its flowers. There's a lot of cute invasive species out there, like the eastern gray squirrel that's now come to the west. Cats, rabbits, fallow deer. They're beautiful animals, and also some of them are very useful. So fallow deer, for example, were brought in as a game animal and have escaped, as you know. So this whole idea that these animals, it's not their fault, that it's not fair or ethical to do anything about them because it's not really their fault that they're here in the first place. So big challenge there, particularly I think around the animal piece. And then this other challenge or difficult related to invasive species outreach is this idea of implementing that it's hard to get a very clear or specific, reader of success. It's often hard to establish without a doubt that an invasive species has been eradicated from an area. So this is also a challenge that funders face because it can be an ongoing drain on funding resources to keep coming back and back and back to an area to actually impact invasive species. So sometimes that makes funding a challenge as well. Then there's this whole area of legal difficulties. So, for example, if someone lets something loose, for example, a goldfish or yellow perch, some invasive fish, or even invasive plants somewhere, whose responsibility is that? There's very few adequate laws that look both provincially, nationally, and internationally. And then there's the whole challenge of internet sales, which can be a huge nightmare for, plants, animals, seeds, everything. Almost impossible to actually manage that. Again, which is why an awareness of invasive species is so important in terms of combating them. So let's take a look at some solutions. And there are solutions out there, which is great. And I know many of you as outreach and education people know about these things, but I'll just go through them briefly. Disconnection, reconnecting people to the environment is so critical. Understanding the systems and the interdependence that we as humans have with the natural world. Combating denial by supporting better understanding, using good tools that we have to use both in terms of outreach and education. And then in terms of the powerlessness and the apathy, providing people with concrete actions that they can take that actually make a difference. So disconnection. So, it's almost self-evident, but this whole idea of reconnecting people through direct experiences as outdoors. Thankfully, there's been more attention paid to this and to the importance of this. Witness the outdoor kindergartens that are around, this whole concept that the Japanese have had for a long, long time, this idea of forest bathing. They actually send their top executives out several times a year to participate in walking through the forest to benefit from the relaxation. And the medical research is fascinating to read too, because it directly links the importance of nature and being active outdoors to so many things. Fundamental childhood development, gross motor skills, also mental and physical health and healing. There's some interesting research around hospitals. If you have a hospital room with a window that looks outside, you're 30% more, you get better 30% quicker than someone with the same injury or illness that doesn't. ADHD, stress release, there's so many great and important issues and things that come out of just getting outside and reconnecting with the natural world. And the other interesting thing I find is that the medical profession has really bought into this. So there's a recent quote from Canada's chief public health officers. Access to active play in nature and outdoors is essential for healthy child development. I love it. So fabulous that is coming out in the medical literature and also in a very public way. So much so that some doctors are actually writing nature prescriptions to their patients, which I find fascinating. And you can check this out further if you want to take a look at the BC Parks Foundation has a great program called Healthy by Nature. So just check out healthybynature.ca. And it was launched last summer on BC Parks Day, and hundreds of people actually got out, led by health professionals, which is pretty cool. They led hundreds of people outside for walks in parks. So really interesting stuff happening around that whole getting people outdoors. The other interesting piece of that is you don't have to have a big wilderness area or a big, natural park near you. You can get out into a backyard. You can get out into a school ground. Just the outdoor piece is so important. So the second thing we talked about is this whole idea of duality, us, the separation between us as humans and the environment. And I think the work around understanding the interdependence and things like direct experiences, things like education, and the media actually through popular shows like Planet Earth. Isn't David Attenborough great? All those things make a big difference in expanding people's understanding of the interdependence. We're so intimately connected to and dependent on the systems and processes of this planet, and I think more this awareness has becoming more and more apparent. So let's take a look at the denial piece. I think, in terms of supporting better understanding is another big way to combat this whole idea of denial. Providing good information, providing positive, direct experiences so people can see for themselves, some of the benefits and some of the impacts around, and particularly around invasive species. So, enabling people to understand and know what native species are and their importance, getting people to understand what invasive species are, and the impacts of invasive species particularly. And around that piece, again, it's so important to know your audience. So focus on issues that are relevant to your audience. Know the people you're speaking to or working with or that are volunteering with you. Because that audience relevance is so critical. Are they anglers? Are they hikers? Are they boaters or campers? Do they love animals? Are they kids? All those pieces, that audience relevance around, building some understanding to combat the denial is so, so important. And I think another part of that is clarifying the terminology that we use. So, as you know, there's a lot of terms that get thrown around. It's important, I think, to provide definitions for those terms that we use and really clarify their meanings, and be consistent. And I just wanted to note that the term alien has been identified by many educators as one not to use, and it's a strange, but a kind of an obvious reason as well, because there are a lot of immigrants, there are a lot of refugees in Canada, and the word alien can have a negative connotation to them. So that's just a little heads up. There's been some interesting articles on that feature. So clarify those definitions. Talk about, what is a native species? Talk about things that are non-native but non-invasive. So, make that clarification. And, give people the characteristics of invasiveness. So, really help them understand what makes something invasive versus not invasive. Sorry, my slides seem to be a little bit slow today. Maybe it's the snow. So what are the tools that we've got, to help increase understanding and, build a little bit more a basis for understanding? I think the main ones we've got are some, better communication models. So the whole idea of how people perceive and process the world around them, there's a lot of research around learning styles and all the different types of learners. And I think as educators or people working with volunteers, it's important to realize that we've got a lot of different learners out there. Howard Gardner talks about 8 multiple intelligences. McCarthy talks about 4. That's I think the minimum that we've got. But thinking about all the different ways that you yourselves learn and all the different ways that people learn, I think it is really important to build that into any kind of program or volunteer effort that we do. So I'm not going to take a long time on this. There's a lot of information out there. But for example, the format system has been used in education for a long time to identify different learners. And you can probably see yourself in one of these 4s. The people that are really skills oriented, very hands-on, the people that love to work by trial and error and are real risk takers, people that love sequential thinking, they love details and data. What shocked me and sort of depressed me when I first ran into learning styles theory is that there's only really one group of people, in this connotation anyway, the analytic learners that do well in traditional classrooms. So, and as educators, that means traditionally we've been targeting our learning to one group of learners and leaving out at least three different types. This doesn't say speak well for our systems. The better communication models also, I think it's important to take a look at some of the current research and also to develop our programs and our events and activities with as much direct input from the users, the people that are using them, as we can. Piloting, of course, is really important to make sure that we're actually, targeting the people that we're wanting to, and just using better tools. So, as you know, the ISCBC, as well as many other groups, have moved to this whole area of research called behavior change or community-based social marketing, where we take a look at barriers for people to actually people doing a behavior that we want, and some of the benefits of doing those behaviors, and then being able to build programs that highlight those benefits. So hence programs like Clean, Drain, Dry, like PlantWise, like Don't Let It Loose, etc. So those tools are important to think through. What do we have? What are the tools we have to use, and are we using the best ones in each situation? So we spoke a little bit about this already. This whole idea of powerlessness. It's such an important area of research, this whole idea of action learning. And it's interesting to me that this whole idea of project-based learning is now embedded quite strongly in the BC school curriculum. So, really supporting hands-on projects and events, something that are participatory. And I think an important piece of this, especially in the action learning piece, when you're doing a fairly large-scale project, it's important to have some clear goals as to what you want to accomplish with a weed pull or with a restoration project, etc. But it's also really important to have some sub-goals based within those clear goals, because I think you need to demonstrate success, all the way along a project, so people get, so you can celebrate those interim successes, even though you may not get to the big hooray, we've just cleaned this whole watershed for years. The interim goals are so important to recognize and to celebrate on the way. So giving people, important to give people really specific, hands-on, very direct actions that they can take to combat that whole sense of powerlessness. And we, as we said earlier, the invasive species, unlike a lot of large-scale issues like biodiversity or like climate change, are something that volunteers can actually do something about. So things like, raising awareness in a public way, building understanding, invasive species removal, management, restoration. These are all, concrete actions that do make a difference and that you can see the results of. So I think really positive, way to make us, give us some tools to make us feel a bit less powerless and to empower us. So I want to talk briefly about volunteering, and again, this is an enormous area of research. But I wanted to touch on a little bit of it, and also some of the more current studies that have come out around volunteering. So volunteering, it's essential. Our society essentially runs on volunteers to a great extent. It's also a fundamental act of good citizenship. And it's really interesting to take a look at some of these statistics that have come out. There's some Canadian studies. There's one done every 5 years, this idea of this general social survey, and it actually targets volunteering and participation. So this one that just came out in 2018 kind of surprised me, because it talks about Canadian youth volunteered more than any other age group, which I think is fabulous. It's only reason why it surprised me is that I belong to a graying community of volunteers, and we feel like we're getting older, and there's not a lot of youth that have coming into our stewardship groups. But I really like that this is actually happening, obviously, in other sectors, that because youth are actually above the national average. There's 44% of Canadians actually volunteer. And, this study in 2018 said 53% of Canadians ages 15 to 24 are actually involved in volunteering. So that's really positive and really exciting for me. So why do people volunteer? Why do, especially young people? I mean, the reasons are fairly similar across the age ranges. Specifically the reasons why young people have given are kind of obvious. I think it's like, reasons 2, 3, and 4 in those bullets. To boost their careers, to build their resumes, to gain new skills, particularly leadership skills and time management stood out. And to gain some real world experience, that helps both professionally and personally. I think that helper's high, that the feel good sensation, is why many of us volunteer, and social reasons come up really strongly too. So people like to do stuff to be seen as a contributing part of their community. They like to be able to do stuff with friends and family, and feel like they're contributing. So interesting to take a look at that research, especially when you're gathering groups of volunteers. To really ask them, why are they here? Why are they wanting to do this? So in 2017, this is another study that was done that took a look at specifically the audience of Canadian youth. Again, 15 to 24. But and a lot of this stuff makes a lot of sense, and is fairly self-evident. But youth are career focused, they're flexible, receptive to new ideas, they're obviously technologically savvy, and they also respond best to innovative online communications and recruitment techniques. So when soliciting volunteers, it's important to use those tools that we've got. Energetic, enthusiastic, like it's again, a lot of them are self-evident, but interesting to think about the peer camaraderie, bringing friends into volunteer activities, and also this whole area of mandatory community service requirements. I mean, this is things like planning 10 in grade 10, where you've got to go out and do some volunteer work and show your results. I stuck this website up here because it's a really great resource. There's courses that you can take. There's handbooks that you can download. There's a lot of research on volunteering. So if you're interested in more of that, please take a look at that volunteer.ca website. It's a great one. There's lots of other ones too. I'd like to hear from people that may have some other studies that they can share with us. So that same study takes a look at preferred tasks. So, who are Canadian youth and what do they like to do? And what was interesting is that they'd like to volunteer with education and research organizations. That was one of the number one things. And the second one was environmental issues. So that bodes well for those of us that work in the environmental field and with invasive species. The other pieces that stood out to me were the international piece. Youth see themselves as world citizens, and the flexibility piece, which I think is for all volunteers, but really, youth are busy people. Most young people in high school and older have jobs. They have other commitments. They have hobbies. They have family commitments. So the flexibility piece is really important for preferred tasks. And also the idea of being able to receive constructive feedback, and of course certification, which speaks to the need for their desire to build their resumes and their career, their CVs a bit. And again, the social piece. So they like to volunteer where they can work with other youth and including their friends. So that flexibility and that inclusiveness, I think, is really important. So this study also looked at barriers. So again, 2017, but still pretty relevant. And I think, again, the barriers are also ones that we can all speak to, this whole idea of lack of time. So 57% of them said, I don't have time to volunteer, or I have very limited time. We have jobs, we have other responsibilities, we have stuff that we're doing. And so both that flexibility piece as to when they can volunteer is really important. Years ago, people were committing to, every Wednesday they'd be somewhere, or every Saturday morning. And that's becoming more and more rare with volunteering. People can give you hours here and there, sometimes a whole day. But again, setting up tasks that are flexible in nature, I think is really important to be able to reach the largest number of volunteers. The environmental field has a specific challenge too, because a lot of people think that they need to know, they need to be experts, or they need to know a lot about an environmental issue, or they need to be scientists to actually contribute effectively to something. And that's something that I think, we all need to work towards, sort of destroying that myth that people are able to do an awful lot as citizen scientists and as volunteers. And to, when we're doing outreach with our volunteers, I think it's important to really stress that no expertise necessary. People, again, barriers to volunteering, people find that they're unaware of opportunities, particularly for environmental stewardship in their communities. So that speaks to us, getting the word out there in a more varied way. And then another interesting piece is this idea of volunteering as a family, which I'd never really thought through before, but that's a big percentage, 68%. Said they'd volunteer more if they could do it with their family. So, that builds another type of challenge into our events. But being able to, have something that older people can do, that parents can do, that kids can do at an event, I think will really increase our ability to reach out to volunteers. So the other piece that sometimes I think we forget is this idea of a recognition. And it's so important to recognize the work that volunteers do. It's pretty self-evident again, but it's interesting to remember some of the reasons why youth volunteer. They're looking to get constructive feedback. They're looking for certification. They're looking for resume builders. And I think the important thing here is it's not a blanket statement. I think you really need to know your individual volunteers to understand how they prefer to be recognized. Some people don't like the recognition to happen publicly. Some people like, to be thanked throughout the year rather than, a big annual reception or a big fancy gift. And many volunteers speak to being more motivated by knowing the impact that they're having on an issue, even on your organization's mission, on their community. They want to know, are their efforts showing any success? And that becomes more of a motivator than, by a certificate or by a gift. And I think specifically youth volunteers, as we said, they want some of the skills that they've demonstrated or acquired to be recognized. So something that, to support their career paths, if you could give them a letter of appreciation, of course, references are important. Those are all big ways that you can recognize volunteers, particularly young volunteers. So I've just got a couple more slides here, but just wanted to summarize, some of the things that we've talked about. We talked about the 4 challenges, this whole idea of disconnection and then reconnection through direct experiences as outdoors. The idea of dualism, where people are seen as separate from the environment, not interdependent on it, and the importance of being explicit around those ecological concepts, so demonstrating the interdependence and the connections that we all have. Battling this whole idea of denial through really working towards a better understanding of environmental issues and invasive species in particular. Making sure we use consistent, clear terms and concepts when we're speaking about environmental issues. And then the powerlessness piece, ensuring that we can help our volunteers to take concrete, meaningful actions. Some of the tools we have are, the education models that we have, ensuring that we are covering a range of learning styles with our volunteers, making sure that they're able to do the things that they're doing in the way that they want to do them as much as possible. Use some of the updated communications models, again, the community-based social marketing, taking a look at barriers and benefits of behaviors. And also really tailoring your programs, making sure that what we're doing is relevant to the specific audience you're working with, that it's meaningful to them, what they are doing, and for them to know why they're doing it. And of course, the whole area of recognition, making sure that your volunteers are recognized and thanked in the way that they want to be thanked. So I'll leave it there, folks. Would love to hear some questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Caitlin. She's going to give us a range of the questions that have come up, and we've still got a few more minutes to deal with those.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sue, for that excellent presentation. So we've got a couple questions in our chat box. If you'd like to add some more in, that would be fantastic. So I'll start with the first one there. So Sue, Pamela writes that, I understand the approaches Sue is referencing and apply them frequently, but how can natural resource professionals better help the public and decision makers filter out the misinformation and noise? Example, opinions and pseudoscience pervade as fact by high-profile scientists.
That's such a great question, Pamela, and I know that book well as well, that The New Wild. I think it's just being as clear as we can about the stuff that we do know about, and the misinformation and noise is out there in a big way now about so many things, particularly environmental issues. And I think just drawing on the information and the details and the science that we do know, and encouraging people to be critical thinkers. Giving them some tools to do that. It's a big question, though, the whole idea of misinformation and this whole idea of what is truth and what is fact. And I know that it's something that many of us have been struggling with. I think some of those the information, particularly around things like invasive species being nature's salvation. I think that's a big way to a crazy way to speak about it. But there's also some interesting work around climate change and warming climates and species being able to move into areas. So there's a lot of stuff that we need to learn about. And I think just encouraging people to be critical thinkers and keeping an open mind, and giving them other things to read when they're speaking about some of the stuff that is quite obviously misinformation.
Perfect. Thank you, Sue. And our next question is from Christina, and she asks, what is a good resource or resources to find clear language terms, concepts to share with volunteers?
Hi, Christina. That's a good question. Now, when you say clear language, are you talking specifically about invasive species language? I'm imagining yes. Yeah, I think I often look in the ecological literature for that, and ISCBC has some definitions that have been used provincially now on our website. If that's what you mean. If anybody else has thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. But I think trying to be consistent is really important, and also clarifying your definitions and your language when you're using them. Hope that answers your question.
And then we have a question from Kirsten. So what are your favorite places to reach out to new volunteers and help people discover the opportunities you are offering?
Interesting question. I often find that, going to meetings and clubs, photography clubs, naturalist clubs is a great way to do it. Of course, I'm a senior person, and I think a really important piece of that is now social media, and being able to use websites, being able to use Twitter and Instagram. I think those things are really important. Video is a great way to engage people. I think you only have 8 seconds to with a video to keep people's attention now, but all the more important to be able to use social media effectively and get your message and your requests out there. I'd love to hear from other people in the room too as to what they use to solicit volunteers.
And then next we'll go to Jessie. So she is wondering if the ISC uses a database or app for organizing volunteers. Is there something that anyone can share to keep our database organized and accessible for folks to change their status?
Hi, Jesse. Great to hear you or see you. That's a good question. Now, I might turn that back over to Caitlin to answer. I think we've been using basic Excel spreadsheets, but Caitlin, do you have anything else to add? Because you're the volunteer coordinator that's doing the databasing.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. So we do have like an online form on our website that we were using. So then that would then send a notification to our main coordinator, and then us as facilitators would then receive the volunteer information, and then we put it into an Excel spreadsheet, just like you mentioned.
Great, and I see some people in the chat adding some resources. Thanks, Jenny, for that mention of Better Impact. I know that one as well, that Canadian Volunteer Management Resource, so that's great. And as Jenny says, most communities do have a local volunteer center, which is a great place to go to. Thanks for that.
Would anyone else like to ask a question? We have a few minutes left before we finish.
I see Pamela's mentioning Meetup and the Green Team too, so that's also a place to look. I'm not sure how many youth use Meetup. That would be interesting to know, but I know I've seen a lot of volunteer opportunities through that. Thanks for that, Pamela. Oh, and Gemma, thanks for that When to Help. I don't know that one, so that's an interesting one. I'll have to check that one out to organize. I believe that's a way to database your volunteers.
Okay, any more questions from any of our guests? Okay, so we have another question here. This one is, what are your recommendations for promoting volunteer weed pull events? We find it challenging to draw people to drop in to our weed pull events.
That's a good question, Kate. I'll let you speak to that as well. I know that when I've done similar events, often I go to groups like guides, scouts to get a larger number of people there. The general public is a little more challenging. Getting word out through posters and stuff doesn't seem to work as well anymore. But there's some good websites, community websites that I've used in the past as well. Caitlin, turning it over to you. If you have some thoughts about that, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, those are great ideas. Also, Facebook is also a great way to get events out as well, if that's something that your organization or group can do. And then depending on the age group of volunteers you're looking for, it's also great to contact local high schools, look into their science departments, and go in and do a presentation about what you're doing and really get youth engaged and excited in these activities. And then we have a question from Simone. So, do you have advice on balancing the harm of chronic pesticide application by different uncoordinated jurisdictions? How much is too much pesticide? When do we accept an invasive as part of the local ecosystem?
Wow, Siobhan, those are big questions. A little bit off topic. In terms of the pesticide use, I mean, that is only one way that obviously invasive species can be managed. I'm not an expert at all in pesticide application, so I can't answer that in a thorough way. But I can get back to you from our field guide that can give you some information around that. Yeah, so I'll keep that question and make sure I have your email to send something back to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Sue. Would anyone else like to ask a question? We still have a few minutes left. Melissa has a question wondering if the webinar will be available afterwards, and yes, it will. So it will be uploaded to the ISC website, and you should also receive a recording, link to the recording of it as well. And then Pamela also has a question. Would it be possible to get a PDF of the PowerPoint? And Sue, I believe that will also be put up on the website as well with the recording.
Yep, for sure, Pamela. You can. We'll get that to you as well.
Perfect. Well, thanks everyone for your wonderful comments of thanks to Sue. And thank you again, Sue, for sharing your expertise with us today. And that's on behalf of the ISC and all of those that are listening today. Just to reiterate again, we will be sending out a short link to an evaluation survey to all participants. If you could please fill it out so we can get your feedback and ideas for future webinars. And you'll also receive a link to watch the recording of the webinar as well. We also have several more exciting webinars coming up, including one next week on responding to agricultural weeds in the caribou by Dave Ralph. Also, check out the ISC website for more information on our upcoming webinars and to register. And thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time, and have a good rest of the day.